All right. Hello. I am Marie Brown. I am the Vice President of the United States chapter of ISPS, the International Society for the Psychological and Social Approaches to Psychosis. Welcome to Psychosis, Sociopolitical Trauma and the Asian Diaspora, a webinar brought to you by ISPS. ISPS is an international organization that promotes psychosocial approaches to experiences commonly called psychosis. We are a membership organization that brings together mental health professionals, people with lived experience of psychosis in extreme states, family members, and allies. Please consider joining us. Membership includes access to many learning opportunities, including clinical supervision groups, book clubs, a research journal, discounts to our annual national and international conferences, and much more. You can check out our website at ISPS-US.org for more information. And we do offer many different tiers of membership, including reduced low-income options. So for tonight's webinar, we're going to hear our panelists discuss and read from their memoirs. And you can go ahead and enter any questions or comments you have into the chat. And then at the last 20 minutes, I'm going to open it up and introduce the questions to our panelists. So now, without further ado, I'm very, very excited to announce our panelists for this evening. Claire Bien is a research associate at Yale University's Program for Recovery and Community Health. She is the author of a memoir, Hearing Voices, Living Fully. She's the president of ISPS-US and a member of the board of directors of the Hearing Voices Network USA. Claire speaks widely on the nature of voice hearing experience and has facilitated Hearing Voices Network support groups since 2014. Her goal in doing this work is to help depathologize the voice hearing experience and increase understanding that is the social conditions of our lives that most profoundly affect people's ability to live fully and with dignity in the world. And Grace Cho is the author of Tastes Like War, a finalist for the 2021 National Book Award in Nonfiction and the winner of the 2022 Asian Pacific American Literature Award in Adult Nonfiction. Her first book, Haunting the Korean Diaspora, Shame, Secrecy, and the Forgotten War, received a 2010 book award from the American Sociological Association. Her writings have appeared in journals such as Catapult, The New Inquiry, Poem Memoir Story, Contexts, Feminist Studies, Women's Studies Quarterly, and Qualitative Inquiry. She is professor of sociology and anthropology at the College of Staten Island, CUNY.
First of all, I want to thank Marie and Claire for the invitation. And I consider it a really wonderful opportunity to be in dialogue with you. Because I think aside from my mom, I have never had the opportunity to speak with a voice hearer. And so I think it's a huge compliment that you have found something meaningful in my work, that you would have invited me to bring it to this audience. And so I'm going to do a couple of readings, but first I want to just give you a little bit of context about how Tastes Like War came into being, and also what has motivated my writing really for the past 20 years, really for my whole adult life. My career has sort of been formed around this quest to try to understand my mother's experience, both in the past, but also in the present as I knew her, as somebody who heard voices. And there were two particular moments in my life that really sparked my curiosity and also my anger, which sort of led me on a path of becoming a scholar and a writer. And the first was when I was 15. It became apparent to me that my mother developed what Western psychiatry calls schizophrenia. And at the time, I tried to seek help for her. And I was met with either denial from my family members, or I was rejected by mental health professionals who said, quote, "There's nothing we can do for your mother." And so, that experience with the mental health care system in the United States when I was 15 really allowed me to see how others saw my mother through this lens of disposability. And so in the book, I write about that moment as the origin of what Koreans call han, which is a word that refers to knotted grief and rage over injustice. And so in 1986, when I was 15 years old, I was basically left, to my own defenses, trying to figure out what was happening. And I searched for explanations. And all I could find was the biological explanation. It was a chemical imbalance of the brain. There was a genetic cause to what was happening to my mom. And everywhere I looked, that was all I found. Messages that my mom had a broken brain and that it had nothing to do with the past. It had nothing to do with social context. But even as a child, I knew there was more to it. And so it was sort of had been percolating as a young person. But then the second moment was on the eve of 1994, a week before my 23rd birthday, when a member of my family revealed a family secret, which was that my mother had been a sex worker for the US military in South Korea. And so, once I started to recover from the trauma of learning the secret and of feeling this sense of shame around it, I started to unpack that and really think about my mother's pain in relation to US imperialism and war and systems of oppression. So I want to be clear that I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with sex work, but in this particular context, it was state sanctioned for a very powerful foreign military. And so taking place within this neo-colonial relationship, it was a form of state violence and coercion. And in fact, just a few months ago, the South Korean Supreme Court ruled in favor of 120 plaintiffs who had filed a lawsuit against the South Korean government for systematically abusing them. And so they, this is a really historic moment for former sex workers in Korea. And all of these women were of my mother's generation, had worked in the system at the same time that she did. And so I spent my whole adult life really trying to trace my mother's past, to look for answers about what had happened to her, what was happening to her, and that no one in my family was willing to answer for me. And so that sort of led me to writing my first book. It involved 10 years of research and writing on the Korean War and US imperialism and the system that I just mentioned. But that 10-year period also coincided exactly with the period in which I was cooking for my mom because she could no longer do that herself. And the trajectory of that 10 years went from, at the beginning, her constantly refusing the food that I offered her, to eventually requesting foods from her childhood and teaching me how to cook my grandmother's dishes. So slowly, over the course of hundreds of meals, she started to talk about the past, and I gained access to this family history that I had never had access to before. But that experience of cooking these meals and sharing those meals with my mom and her voices completely transformed my understanding of what we call mental illness or psychosis. So I'm going to read a passage, and this is from the title chapter called Tastes Like War. And this takes place in 2001, 2002, right after she moves into an apartment above my brother's garage. My brother and his wife seemed to think that things would improve once my mother had a place of her own. I suppose it was a reasonable assumption. During the first few months, she still didn't want to eat. They tried some of the same tricks I'd resorted to when she was at my place in Queens, like leaving food for her in the hopes she'd eat it, knowing how much she hated for things to go to waste. They also stocked her pint-sized kitchen with large quantities of packaged foods that required no more preparation than adding water or opening a can. According to my sister-in-law, my mother was eating the ramen and fruit cocktail, but had barely touched the powdered milk. Although I felt some relief knowing that she wasn't starving, I also felt ashamed that her diet was so bereft of nutrition. "Mom, are you getting enough to eat?" I asked. She nodded. "What about protein?" She nodded again, then snorted. They got me powdered milk. Oh yeah? I said, feigning surprise. She became quiet as if she had already lost her train of thought and was deep in some hallucinatory reverie. I can't stand the taste of it, she said. Tastes like war. It was only the second time she ever brought up the war without my prompting. Her words jolted me into a reverie of my own as fragments of my research tumbled around in my head. Images of babies sitting on dirt roads next to the bodies of their dead mothers, and napalmed women bandaged like mummies. The words of a woman who survived the Nogani massacre, who lost her child when American planes dropped bombs from above. That day, I saw the two faces of America. The words of a war bride who remembered American food aid. I had heard of the Yankees and how they were here to save us. We were all hoping for rice or barley, and we drooled at the thought of so much food. But it was an endless supply of powdered milk that caused all who drank it to suffer for days with diarrhea. In February 2002, my mother finally went to the hospital after my brother and sister-in-law called an ambulance and had her admitted on the grounds that she was trying to starve herself to death. After the hospitalization, she started meds again, started to eat again, but still not much, not everything. Her resistance still took the form of rejecting food, but the foods she couldn't or wouldn't eat were very specific, like the powdered milk. After Arnold Schwarzenegger was elected as California's governor, she asked me to stop buying her Arnold bread. Mom, you know it has nothing to do with him, right? The name is just a coincidence, I said. She smiled and let out a little laugh, as if she knew how crazy it sounded. She always seemed to put a great deal of thought into her choices to eat or not eat something. In time, I recognized these choices as an expression of agency, tiny acts of rebellion against enormous structures of power. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. There are so many questions that I have in my mind for you. I do want to share that my sister also recalled having had powdered milk during the war years in China in the 1940s, and she actually liked it. But the primary question I have for you is whether your mother really was sorry, I'm much more nervous than I had anticipated being, but I was wondering if in fact she were perhaps not trying to starve herself to death, but rather was felt that the food was poisoned. And because a common occurrence among voice hearers, and I have had this experience, is that when we are given something to drink or to eat, I have become really, really spaced out. I'm unable to focus and to remember my train of thought and focus upon what I'm trying to say. There is some feeling of fear and trauma. It may be associated with the food. It may be associated with the source of the food, or the context in which it's been offered. And one of the training, a part of the training of the Hearing Voices facilitator groups is there is a role play where people where a person is accused of
yeah. So it's really interesting because I hadn't really considered that before. But I know that, I mentioned that, and also it comes up in this reading, that there was a long period of time when she was just refusing food. And it wasn't always clear to me what the reason was. Sometimes she gave a very clear reason. Like, for example, I think maybe in one of the other segments I'm going to read later, she would say, well, cooking is a waste of time. She didn't want me to spend my time doing that. But then there were times where she just, like, it was inexplicable to me, as somebody who was not inside her experience, where she would just look at it and just, refuse to engage it, or even, look at the food and just say, I don't want that, in a way that was, very troubling. Like, she was very troubled by it. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there were definitely some instances where she was suspicious of the food itself. Yes. And we had a very difficult relationship for many years. And I didn't even know the extent of it, because she kept a lot of it to herself. But, as I mentioned, when I was 15 and I went to the community mental health care center, and they told me, one of the things that the counselor told me was that only the police could help my mom get help. And so as this young teenager who doesn't know anything, I tried that. I tried calling the police, and they arrested her and they took her to jail, which was not at all what I thought was going to happen. And it turned out that for, years, more than a decade, she could not forgive me for that. I think it was like maybe 15 or 16 years before she was able to forgive me.